بهره برداری امن از موبایل و اینترنت، زن، حقوق فردی و اجتماعی، سازوکارهای جلوگیری از نقض حقوق بشر، پویشی در مفهوم دموکراسی، مروری بر پایگیری نهادهای مدنی در ایران، اندیشه‌های نوین از حقوق کارگران، آموزش خبرنگاری، حقوق شهروندی امروز و محیط زیست. توانا، رایگان توانایی ما را به سمت انسان امروزین جهانی متمدن تازه می کند. برای شرکت در این کلاس ها به توانا.org بروید و با جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. از طریق فیسبوک، توییتر و شبکه یوتیوب می توانید آموزشکده توانا را دنبال کنید. توانا آموزشکده است برای جامعه مدنی ایران.
To set the historical context, I'd like to begin by pointing out that not only are we approaching the 50th anniversary of the publication of Solzhenitsyn's first books, but I'm also standing to you tonight just 4 months shy of the 60th anniversary of Stalin's death. In commemoration of that event, I'd like to read a very short excerpt from the memoirs of his daughter Svetlana, who sat by his deathbed until the very end. For the last 12 hours, she wrote, the lack of oxygen became acute. The death agony was terrible. He literally choked to death as we watched. At what seemed to be the very last moment, he opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room. It was a terrible glance, insane or perhaps angry, and full of the fear of death. Within days of Stalin's demise, his henchmen, Beria and then Khrushchev, began dismantling one of the Soviet leader's signature achievements, namely his concentration camps. They did so for many reasons. Some had wives and relatives in the camps. Some feared retribution from others who did. Most of all, though, they did so because the camps were an economic disaster, which they knew, and about which more in a moment. And some feared they were a political disaster waiting to happen as well. No one, of course, knew better than Stalin's Politburo just how many people imprisoned within them were innocent. Yet, although they knew this, none of Stalin's Soviet successors, not Nikita Khrushchev, not Leonid Brezhnev, and not in the end even Mikhail Gorbachev, was far-seeing or politically powerful enough to finish the job of dismantling the system and the memory of the system. And as a result, both the economic and the moral legacy of the camps continue to distort Russian society today. And so one might say that Stalin is dead, but his last terrible gaze still casts its shadow. But although the legacy of the Gulag is the ultimate subject of my talk tonight, I want to begin with a brief account of what we have learned about the camps, not really since the time of Stalin's death, but in particular what we know now that we did not know 10 or 15 years ago. I've never claimed that in writing my narrative history of the Gulag that I discovered a new topic that had never been touched on before. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the history of the camp system that he wrote and published in the West in the 1970s, largely got the outline right. Although he had no access to archives and he based all of his writing on letters and the memoirs of other prisoners, he did, it now appears, understand the basic outline of the Gulag's history from its earliest incarnation on the Sovietsky Islands in the White Sea, through its spread across the far north, and then around the country, proving, in fact, that prisoners' gossip, as it was sometimes dismissed, was not as inaccurate as many people thought. In the years, though, that I spent researching my book, I concluded that archives can make a difference to how we understand Soviet history. There are a lot of stories now about archives closing, but just to be clear, I was able in the 90s to work in archives in Moscow and Karelia, and I had access to documents from archives in St. Petersburg, Perm, Vorkuta, Kolyma, and Novosibirsk. At one point, I was handed a part of the archive of a small camp, kind of lagpunkt, called Kadrovy Shore in the far north, and I was politely asked if I wanted to buy it, which I did. Of course, it's now at the Hoover Institute. What was available to me was very often quite ordinary, the day-to-day archive of the Gulag administration, for example, with inspectors' reports and financial accounts, letters from camp directors to their supervisors in Moscow. But when reading these documents, the full extent of the system and its importance to the Soviet economy comes sharply into focus. Certainly these documents enabled me to be far more precise than was ever possible in the past. Thanks to archives, we now know, for example, that there were at least 476 camp systems, each one made up of hundreds or even thousands of individual camps or lagpunkts, sometimes spread out over thousands of square miles of otherwise empty tundra. We know that the vast majority of prisoners in them were peasants and workers and not the intellectuals who later wrote memoirs and books. We know that with a few exceptions, Stalin's camps were not designed in order to kill people. They were not constructed that way because Stalin preferred to use firing squads to conduct his mass executions. Nevertheless, they were at times very lethal. Nearly a quarter of the Gulag's prisoners died during the war years. They were also very fluid. Prisoners left because they died, because they escaped, because they had short sentences, because they were being released into the Red Army, or because they had been promoted from prisoner to guard, as sometimes happened. There were also frequent amnesties for the old, the ill, for pregnant women, and for anyone else no longer useful to the forced labor system. And these releases were inevitably followed by new waves of arrests. As a result, we now also know that between 1929, when they first became a mass phenomenon, and 1953, the year of Stalin's death, some 18 million people passed through the Soviet Gulag. So in addition, a further 6 or 7 million people were deported not to camps, but to exile villages. In total, that means that the number of people with some experience of imprisonment and the penal system in Stalin's Soviet Union could have run as high as 25 million, or about 15% of the population. We also now know where the camps were, namely everywhere. Although probably all of us are familiar with the image of the prisoner in the snowstorm digging coal with a pickaxe, there were also camps in central Moscow where prisoners built apartment blocks or designed airplanes. There were camps in Krasnoyarsk where prisoners ran nuclear power plants, and there were fishing camps on the Pacific coast. The Gulag photo albums in the Russian State Archive, which I've seen, are chock full of pictures of prisoners with their camels. From Akhtubinsk to Yakutsk, there was, in the end, not a single major population center that did not have its own local camp or camps, and not a single industry that did not employ prisoners. Over the years, prisoners built roads, railroads, power plants, chemical factories. They manufactured weapons, they made furniture, even children's toys. So in the Soviet Union of the 1940s, the decade the camps reached their zenith, it would have been difficult in many places to go about your daily business and not run into prisoners. So it's no longer possible to argue, as some Western historians once did, that the camps were known to only a small proportion of the population. Of course, we also now understand better the chronology of the camps. We've long known that Lenin built the first ones in 1918 at the time of the revolution, as a kind of ad hoc emergency measure to contain the enemies of the people and prevent counter-revolution. We also have known that he and his successors expanded them to the Solovetsky Islands in the early 1920s. But the archives shed a good deal of light on why Stalin chose to expand them further in 1929. In that year, Stalin launched the 5-year plan, an extraordinarily costly attempt in human lives and natural resources to force a 20% annual increase in the Soviet Union's industrial output and to collectivize agriculture. This plan, as most of you in this room will know, led to millions of arrests as peasants were forced off their land and they were imprisoned if they refused. But it also led to an enormous labor shortage. Suddenly, the Soviet Union found itself in need of coal, gas, and minerals, which could only be found in the far north of the country. Following a series of discussions, which used almost exclusively economic language to justify the expansion of the camps, the decision was taken at the very highest levels of the Soviet government, of the party, that prisoners should be used to extract these needed minerals. And to the secret policemen who were then charged with carrying out the construction of the camps, this solution made a lot of sense. And so here is how Alexei Loginov, who's the former deputy commander of the Norilsk camps north of the Arctic Circle, justified the use of prisoner labor in a 1992 interview. He said, "If we had sent civilians, we would first have had to build houses for them to live in. And how could civilians live there? With prisoners, it's easy. All you need is a barrack, a stove with a chimney, and they survive." Prisoners in Gulag documents are very often referred to as contingenti, contingents. From the point of view of the Soviet leadership and of the camp commanders, they were an ingredient in production. They were like lumps of coal or bars of steel. Enemies of the people didn't need to live like civilians in normal houses at all, which made them both cheaper and more expendable. None of this is to say that the camps, in addition to their economic function, were not also intended to terrorize and subjugate the population. Certainly it's true that prison and camp regimes, which were dictated in very minute detail by Moscow, were openly designed to humiliate prisoners. Famously, prisoners' belts, buttons, garters, and items made of elastic were taken away from them. They were described as enemies. They were forbidden to use the word comrade, even with one another. Such measures contributed to the dehumanization of prisoners in the eyes of camp guards and bureaucrats, who therefore found it that much easier not to treat them as fellow citizens and maybe not even as fellow human beings. In fact, this turned out to be an incredibly powerful ideological combination. The disregarding of the humanity of prisoners combined with the overwhelming need to fulfill the plan. And nowhere is this clearer, I found, than in the camp inspection reports, which were submitted periodically by local prosecutors and are now kept neatly on file in the Moscow archives. When I first began to read them, I was quite shocked, both by their frankness and by the peculiar kind of outrage they express. So describing conditions in Volgolag, a railroad construction camp in Tatarstan in July 1942, one inspector complained, for example, that, quote, "The whole population of the camp, including free workers, lives off flour. The only meal for prisoners is so-called bread made from flour and water without meats or fats." Unquote. As a result, the inspector went on indignantly, there are high rates of illness, particularly scurvy, and not surprisingly, the camp was failing to meet its production norms. Well, this outrage ceased to seem surprising after I'd read several dozen similar reports, each of which used more or less the same sort of language, and each of which ended with more or less the same ritual conclusion. Conditions must be improved so that the prisoners will work harder and so that production norms will be met. Very little was actually done. While it might have been expected that living conditions in the Gulag would be poor during the war, as they were all over the Soviet Union, a nationwide inspection of 23 large camps in 1948 still concluded, among other things, that 75% of the prisoners in Norilsk, in northern Siberia and Norilsk, had no warm boots, that the number of prisoners unfit for hard labor in Karelia had recently tripled, that death rates were still, quote unquote, too high in half a dozen camps, that is, too high to allow for efficient production. These reports reminded me very much of the inspectors of Gogol's era. The forms were observed, the reports were filed, the effects on actual human beings were ignored. There would be a result. Camp commanders were routinely reprimanded for failing to improve living conditions. Living conditions continued to fail to improve, and there the discussion ended. Of course, the level of specificity in these reports also clears up any remaining doubt about who was in control of the camps, and the central government or the regional bosses. And back in Moscow, they knew exactly what camps were like, and they knew really in very great detail. Now, without question, the expansion of the camps in this period and later distorted the Soviet economy. With so much cheap labor available, the Soviet economy took far longer than it should have done to become mechanized. All kinds of problems were solved just by calling for more workers. With so many, famously, of course, the White Sea Canal was built with pickaxes. With so many poorly trained people working under coercion, construction was not of the highest quality either. By one account, labor productivity among free workers in the forestry industry was 3 times higher than among workers in the camps. Nevertheless, the camps also distorted the way that people in the lands of the former Soviet Union thought about economics, which is a point I'd like to illustrate by describing a trip I took to Vorkuta a few years ago on the Arctic Circle. Vorkuta's history begins in 1931 when a group of colonists first arrived in the region by boat up the northern waterways. Although even the czars had known about the region's enormous coal reserves, no one had ever managed to work out precisely how to get the coal out of the ground, given the sheer horror of life in a place where temperatures regularly drop to minus 30 or minus 40 in the winter, and where the sun does not shine for 6 months of the year, and where in the summertime the flies and the mosquitoes, as I can testify, they travel in these big dark clouds. Nevertheless, Stalin found a way by making use of another sort of vast reserve. Vorkuta's 23 original settlers were, of course, prisoners, and the leaders of that founding expedition were, of course, secret policemen. So over the subsequent 2.5 decades, 1 million more prisoners would eventually pass through Vorkuta, which is one of the 2 or 3 most notorious hubs of the Gulag. With the help of prisoners, the Soviet authorities in Vorkuta built shops and swimming pools and schools. The cost of heating shoddy Soviet apartment blocks for 11 months of the year was astronomical, far more, as it turned out, than the value of the coal itself. The city's infrastructure, built on constantly shifting permafrost, required huge efforts to maintain. Miners could instead have been flown in and out on 2-week or 4-week shifts, as they are in Canada or Alaska. Nevertheless, Vorkuta, the city, kept going throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and some 70,000 people still live there today. The truth, of course, is that Vorkuta was, and still is, completely unnecessary. Why build kindergartens and university lecture halls in the tundra? Why build a puppet theater? Vorkuta has 3, or did when I was there. Maybe they've closed down. But in Vorkuta, it's surprisingly difficult to make that argument or ask such questions, even now. I asked them, for example, of Zhenya, who is a retired geologist with whom I spent the better part of a day. And together, she and I walked around the city. We went to see the prisoner cemeteries, which have been memorialized in recent years. We walked around the ruined Geological Institute, which was a once solid structure complete with a columned Stalinist portico and a red star on the pediment. And although Zhenya's Polish parents had been deported to Vorkuta in the 1940s, although she knows and willingly recounts the city's history, Zhenya nevertheless spent a good part of the day railing against the thief Democrats and the greedy bureaucrats who had, probably sensibly, decided to shut the institute down. So if your whole life has been associated with the place, it is hard to admit that that place should never have existed. And even if that place is widely famed for atrocity and for stupidity, and even if it is notoriously unpleasant, it's even harder to admit that it should never have been built at all. But if Zhenya, who was herself the daughter of victims, was unable to understand why her city is now being dismantled, then who can understand it? And that question brings me to the next part of my talk tonight, in which I would like to ask why the Gulag, about which historians, Soviet historians and Russian historians now know so much, and whose economic impact we understand so much better, why is it so seldom debated and discussed by Russians? One of the things which always strikes contemporary visitors to Russia is the lack of monuments to Stalin's victims. Arnie mentioned it a minute ago. Yes, there are a few scattered memorials. There are places, as in Vorkuta, there is a prisoner's cemetery. In Kolyma, there's a small, not even that small, there's a statue. But there is no national monument or place of mourning. And in fact, the absence of monuments is a good measure because it accurately indicates an absence of public awareness. Of course, those of you who know recent history know that there were wide-ranging discussions of Soviet repression in the late 1980s during Gorbachev's reign, during Glasnost, and it's equally true that these discussions were extremely important and they played a very big role in delegitimizing the Soviet regime. Nevertheless, that bitter debate about justice for victims and about history is now really quite completely over, and more importantly, it left no political institutions in its wake. Although there was much talk about it at the end of the 1980s, the Russian government never did examine or try the perpetrators of torture or mass murder, even those who were identifiable at the time. There were no truth commissions, either of the sort implemented in South Africa, which might have allowed victims to tell their stories in public, in an official public place, and to make the crimes of the past a part of contemporary debate. So, and the result, predictably, is that half a century after the end of World War II, the Germans still conduct regular public debates about victims' compensation, about memorials, about new interpretations of Nazi history, even about whether a younger generation of Germans should go on shouldering the burden of guilt about the crimes of the Nazis. Half a century after Stalin's death, 60 years after Stalin's death, there are no equivalent arguments taking place in Russia because the memory of the past is not a living part of public discourse. Now, I should say, and those of you who know Russia will know this, that at some level the reasons for this are not hard to fathom. The Stalinist era was really a long time ago, and a great deal has happened since it ended. Post-Soviet Russia is not the same as post-Soviet Germany, where the memories of the worst atrocities are still fresh in people's minds. The memory of the camps, or I should say post-communist Russia, the memory of the camps is also confused in Russia by the presence of so many other atrocities. War, famine, collectivization. Why should camp survivors get special treatment? People have said that to me. Further confused by the link made in some people's minds between the discussion of the past that took place in the 1980s and the economic collapse which followed in the 1990s. What was the point of talking about all that, people said to me. It got us nowhere. There's also a question of pride. Like Zhenya, many experienced the collapse of the Soviet Union as a personal blow. Perhaps the old system was bad, they now feel, but at least we were powerful. And now that we aren't powerful, we don't want to hear that it's bad. It was bad. Nevertheless, the most important explanation for the lack of debate is not the fears and anxieties of ordinary Russians, but the nature of the country's new ruling class. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is a former KGB officer who has described himself as a Chekist, deliberately using the word for Lenin's hated political police. Famously, the Russian president has also described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, presumably meaning greater than World Wars I or II. Under his watch, Soviet flags have returned to anniversary parades, and the Soviet national anthem has been revived, albeit with new words, and nobody knows them. His intentions are clear enough to me and to those around him, as I'll explain in greater depth in a later lecture in February. Putin is and was trying to create an alternate version of post-Soviet history, one which supports his ideology. Thus 1989 was not a moment of liberation, but the beginning of economic collapse. The hardships and the deprivations of the 1990s were not the result of decades of communist neglect or widespread thievery, but of Western-style capitalism and democracy. Communism was at least stable and safe. Post-communism has been a disaster. The Soviet Union was powerful. Russia, at least until recently, was a failure. The more people believe all of this, the less likely they are to want a system which is more genuinely democratic and genuinely capitalist. The more nostalgia for Soviet-era symbols, the more he seems to believe more secure his KGB clique is going to be. This failure to repent or to discuss or even to dwell on the past is a part of this explanation for this redirecting of history towards the political needs of the present rulers. It has also had consequences for the formation of Russian civil society and for the development of the rule of law. It helps to explain, for example, why so many Russians are not bothered by certain kinds of censorship or by the FSB, the new incarnation of KGB's ability to open mail, tap telephones, or enter private residences without a court order. I think there's a deeper significance, too. To put it very bluntly, if the scoundrels of the old regime go unpunished, good will in no sense be seen to have triumphed over evil. This may sound, I don't know, apocalyptic or American, but it's not politically irrelevant. After 1991, the secret police kept their apartments, their dachas, and their large pensions. Their victims remained poor and marginal and still are. And to most Russians, it now seems as if the more you collaborated in the past, the wiser you were. By analogy, the more you cheat and lie in the present, the wiser you are now. Personally, what bothers me the most about Russia's lack of interest in its past is the way it has deprived young people of a whole category of heroes. The names of those who secretly opposed Stalin ought to be as widely known in Russia as are in Germany, for example, the names of people who took part in the plot to kill Hitler. The incredibly rich body of Russian survivors' literature, really extraordinary stories of people whose humanity triumphed over the horrifying conditions of Soviet labor camps, should be better read and better known and more frequently quoted. If school children knew these heroes and their stories better, they would find something else to be proud of in Russia's past, Soviet past, aside from imperial military triumphs. This, after all, is the country that invented the modern human rights movement. But in today's Russia, those early human rights activists have left a very thin legacy. On the contrary, Russian indifference to the past may also have helped create a widespread indifference to judicial and police reform. Political trials and harsh sentences are now returning. A few weeks ago, two young women, were sentenced to a Siberian labor camp as punishment for a political protest. Well, many such places have changed surprisingly little. Some years ago, I visited a criminal prison in Arkhangelsk, and I emerged really genuinely reeling from what I'd seen. These women's cells with their hot, heavy air and sort of overwhelming stench really made me feel as I was walking into the past, into one of Yevgenia Ginsburg's descriptions of her Stalinist-era prisons. In one cell, I met a sobbing 15-year-old girl who'd been accused of stealing the ruble equivalent of $10. She'd been in jail without a hearing for a week. Afterwards, I spoke to the prison boss. It all was about money, he said. He said, the prison warders are rude because they're badly paid. The ventilation is bad because the building is old and needs repairs. Electricity is expensive, so we have to keep the corridors dark. Trials are delayed because there aren't enough judges. Now, I wasn't convinced. Money is a problem, but it's not the whole explanation. If Russia's prisons still look like a scene from a Gulag memoir, and if Russia's courts and criminal investigations are still heavily politicized, that's partly because the Soviet legacy does not haunt Russia's criminal police, secret police, judges, jailers, or businessmen. But then very few people in contemporary Russia feel the past to be a burden or an obligation at all. Like a great unopened Pandora's box, the past lies in wait for another generation. Yet, do we in the West remember the Soviet past any better? One of the reasons I wrote my Gulag book, really horribly 15 years ago now, it's hard to believe when I started it, was because I really encountered this subject only while living in Eastern Europe, and I started to wonder why. Since there are presumably some other book writers in the room tonight, I can also confess that I was inspired by an extremely irritating New York Times review of my first book in 1994, which was about the western borderlands of the Soviet Union. And although, of course, largely positive, it contained the following line, quote, here, meaning Ukraine and Belarusia, here occurred the terror famine of the 1930s in which Stalin killed more Ukrainians than Hitler murdered Jews. Yet how many in the West remember it? After all, the killing was so boring and ostensibly undramatic. Were Stalin's murders boring? Many people think so. Indeed, and I've just added this sentence an hour ago, perhaps not coincidentally, a brand new New York Times review of my brand new book, Iron Curtain, also asks why anyone should care nowadays about Soviet atrocities in Eastern Europe. Haven't we all heard this before, is what more or less the conclusion. Until recently, it was of course possible to explain this absence of popular feeling in our part of the world about the tragedy of European communism as the logical result of a particular set of circumstances. The passage of time is part of it. Again, communist regimes really did grow less reprehensible as the years went by. Nobody was very frightened of General Yaroselsky or even of Brezhnev, although, of course, both were responsible for a great deal of destruction. Besides, archives were closed, access to campsites was forbidden, No television cameras ever filmed the Soviet camps or their victims as they did in Germany at the end of World War II. No images in turn meant that the subject in our image-driven culture didn't really exist either. Of course, to some extent, ideology twisted the ways in which we understood Soviet and East European history as well. In fact, in the 1920s, a great deal was known in the West about the bloodiness of Lenin's revolution. Western socialists, many of whose brethren had been jailed by the Bolsheviks right after the revolution, protested loudly and strongly against those arrests. Nevertheless, in the 1930s, however, as Americans and West Europeans became more interested in learning how socialism or elements of socialism could be applied here, the tone changed. Writers and journalists went off to the USSR, trying to learn lessons they could use at home. And the New York Times employed a correspondent, famously, Walter Duranty, who lauded the 5-year plan and argued that it was a massive success and won a Pulitzer Prize for doing so. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, a part, not all, but a part of the Western left struggled to explain and sometimes excuse the camps and the terror which created them precisely because they wanted to make use of some aspect, even distantly, of the Soviet experiment at home. Now, but it's not only the left. In fact, our determination to ignore Soviet terror solidified even further during the Second World War when Stalin was our ally. In 1944, the then American Vice President, Henry Wallace, who was fortunately next replaced by Truman, actually went to Kolyma, which was one of the most notorious camps, during a trip across the USSR. And imagining he was visiting some kind of industrial complex, he told his host that, quote, Soviet Asia reminded him of the Wild West. Quote, the vast expanses of your country, her virgin forests, wide rivers, and large lakes, all kinds of climate from tropical to polar, her inexhaustible wealth remind me of my homeland. It's an American, yeah? According to a report, the boss of Kolyma later wrote for Beria, the head of the security services, Wallace did ask to see prisoners, but he was kept away. He was not alone, of course, in refusing to see the truth, and you can hardly blame him. Roosevelt and Churchill had their photographs taken with Stalin, too. All of that contributed to our firm conviction that the Second World War was a wholly just war. And very few people today want that conviction shaken. We remember D-Day, liberation of the Nazi camps, the children welcoming American GIs, with cheers on the streets. And we don't want to remember, we try not to remember, that the camps of Stalin, our ally, expanded just as the camps of Hitler, our enemy, were liberated. And nobody wants to think that we defeated one mass murder with the help of another. During the Cold War, it's true, our awareness of Soviet atrocities went up. In the 1960s, they receded again. Even in the 1980s, I remember it well, there were still American academics who went on describing the advantages of East German healthcare or Polish peace initiatives. In the academic world, when I went to university, Soviet historians who wrote about the camps generally divided up into two groups. Those who wrote about them as criminal and those who downplayed them, if not because they were actually pro-Soviet, then because they didn't like Ronald Reagan. So right up into the end, our views of the Soviet Union and its repressive system always had more to do with American politics and American ideological struggles and political arguments than they ever had to do with the Soviet Union itself. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, much has really changed. World War II now belongs to a previous generation. The Cold War is over too, and the alliances and the international fault lines it produced have shifted for good. The Western left and the Western right now compete over completely different issues. It's become finally possible for us to stop looking at the history of the Soviet Union through the narrow lens of Western politics. It's possible, and I'll conclude by saying it's also necessary. It's true that our tolerance for the occasional gulag denier in our universities will not destroy the moral fabric of our society, and even I don't think that the fashion for hammer and sickle t-shirts will corrupt our youth forever. Nevertheless, it's true that if we fail to incorporate what we do know now about the Gulag into our own memory of Europe and our own memory of European history, there will be consequences. After all, it is our history. Why did we fight the Cold War after all? Was it because crazed right-wing politicians, in cahoots with the military-industrial complex and the CIA, invented the whole thing and they forced 2 generations of Americans and West Europeans to go along with it? Or was there something more important happening? I'm not sure we still remember what it was that mobilized us, what inspired us, and what held the civilization of the West together for so long. At the same time, if we don't study the history of the Gulag, then some of what we know about mankind itself will be distorted. Every one of the 20th century's mass tragedies was unique. The Gulag, the Holocaust, the Armenian massacre, the Nanking massacre, the Cultural Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, the Bosnian Wars, I could go on. Every single one of these events had different historical and philosophical origins, and they arose in circumstances that will never be repeated. But our ability to debase and destroy and dehumanize our fellow men has been and will be repeated again and again. Our transformation of our neighbors into enemies, our reinvention of our victims as lower, lesser, evil beings, worthy only of incarceration or expulsion or death. The more we understand about how different societies have transformed their neighbors and fellow citizens into objects, the more we know of the specific circumstances which led to each episode of mass murder, the better we will understand the darker side of our own human nature. I wrote my book about the Gulag not so that it will never happen again, as the cliche has it, but because it will happen again. We need to know why. Each story, each memoir, and each document is a piece of the puzzle. Without them, we'll wake up one day and realize that we do not know who we are. Thank you very much.
بهره برداری امن از موبایل و اینترنت، زن، حقوق فردی و اجتماعی، سازوکارهای جلوگیری از نقض حقوق بشر، پویشی در مفهوم دموکراسی، مروری بر پایگیری نهادهای مدنی در ایران، اندیشه‌های نوین از حقوق کارگران، آموزش خبرنگاری، حقوق شهروندی امروز و محیط زیست. توانا، رایگان توانایی ما را به سمت انسان امروزین جهانی متمدن تازه می کند. برای شرکت در این کلاس ها به توانا.org بروید و با جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. از طریق فیسبوک، توییتر و شبکه یوتیوب می توانید آموزشکده توانا را دنبال کنید. توانا آموزشکده است برای جامعه مدنی ایران.